This is part 2 of the lecture on Cosmopolitanism and Utopia, Global Pop in the 21st Century. So at the end of the part 1 video, I asked this question, and I also asked you to have a look at some musical examples. So hopefully you've watched the video of Manu CHao, Clandestino, and the videos of M.I.A. as well. So I'll say a little bit more about Manu CHao a little bit later in this session. For now, I guess I just want to pick out the themes from that video of the idea of an international community, the idea of migration, the idea of nationalities, and the ability and also the restrictions that are placed on travel and on moving from one cultural space to another. If you have any Spanish, you might have picked up on some of the lyrics as well and realized that the lyrics in the song are also relate to traveling and to migrating as well. With the M.I.A. tracks, I chose the track Jimmy, which is a track from M.I.A.'s 2007 album Kala, which is based on a sample, or we might say a cover version almost, of a Bollywood song. And I've also put the Bollywood song up for you to see as well. And the Bollywood film that came from is a film called Disco Dancer from 1982. And it's one of a number of disco-themed Bollywood films that were made at that time. And I think it's really interesting to think about Bollywood as a cosmopolitan kind of cinema, a cinema that draws on many influences from different parts of the world. And brings them together in many different musical styles. So Bollywood has shown that it's always able to adapt to global musical styles, regardless of what they are. And so in the 70s and 80s, we see this shift towards disco music to represent a kind of global disco language. So that's a really interesting film to watch anyway, the original film. It's also, interestingly, a film that had a very large success internationally as well, particularly in the Soviet Union, as was, and also in China as well. So, you know, often we're talking about these kind of global networks, but I think it's also interesting to think about how networks which we might not be so familiar with in the UK, and in particular the massive popularity of Bollywood, and particularly that film in Soviet Russia, and also in China as well. So in that sense, it seems, if we're going to think about M.I.A. as a cosmopolitan artist, it seems appropriate that she would draw on Bollywood as one of her sources to sample from, and to kind of pay homage to as well. Now there's a question which might linger in the background as to what extent M.I.A. is appropriating Indian culture in that video to Jimmy, and that's not something I'm going to address at this point, but it might be something that's worth thinking about when you read the article by Janyna Brown, which I'm asking you to read this week, and also if that was something that you wanted to discuss in the seminar or in a tutorial, we could pick up on that issue then as well. I also put a video of M.I.A. collaborating with the Portuguese group Barraca Som Sistema. So Barraca Som Sistema were a group that formed in Lisbon, and were really key in the sort of early 2010s, or just before 2010, so the first decade of the 2000s, in popularizing a lot of Afro-Portuguese dance music, particularly the music of Kuduro as well. And that track, Sound of Kuduro, is an example of that, where they're using these Kuduro beats, and they're also, what the video shows them doing is actually traveling to Angola for the first time, which at the beginning of the video, they've just arrived in Luanda. And then they're collaborating with a series of Angolan artists as well. So much of the rapping that you hear on that track is from Angolan Kuduro artists. So that's an interesting kind of migration, if you like. You've got this Angolan-inspired music that was being made in Lisbon, in Portugal, and then this group traveling to Angola to experience where the music came from, and at the same time collaborating with M.I.A. as well. So we'll come back to M.I.A. and Manu CHao a little bit later on, but for now, let's think about cosmopolitanism. and what that word means and what cosmopolitanism means. So, one thing you may have done to look up cosmopolitan is to have a look on Google. And what do we find if we plug cosmopolitan into Google? Well, what you probably would find is a reference to the magazine Cosmopolitan. So you would need to refine your search a little bit to either look for a cosmopolitan definition or to look specifically for cosmopolitan in relation to the discussion of society and discussion of people. So we're not talking about the magazine. We're also not talking about the cocktail either, known as a cosmopolitan. What we're talking about instead is what we can find in these definitions here. So we have a dictionary definition at the top of the screen there. The adjective cosmopolitan refers to people from many different countries. Immigration transformed the city into a cosmopolitan metropolis. And also something that is found all over the world. We also use cosmopolitan as a noun, so you might describe a person as a cosmopolitan, and that would, if you called someone a cosmopolitan, you would basically be saying they're a cosmopolitan person, or you would be referring to them in a way that comes from the sort of philosophical or political definition of cosmopolitanism, which we can find lower down in the screen. So there we have a political philosophy definition. Cosmopolitanism is the idea that all human beings are, or could, or should be, members of a single community. Different views of what constitutes this community may include a focus on moral standards, economic practices, political structures, and or cultural forms. But behind that is the idea that we're all part of a community. So when I'm talking in this session about cosmopolitan or cosmopolitanism, it's with these kinds of definitions that I have in mind. Here's another one. This is from Roger Scruton, the philosopher Roger Scruton, and this one refers to, this is taken, from a dictionary of political thought, and Scruton describes cosmopolitanism as a belief in and a pursuit of a style of life which shows acquaintance with and ability to incorporate the manners, habits, and languages and social customs of cities throughout the world. In this sense, the cosmopolitan is often seen as a kind of parasite who depends upon the quotidian lives of others to create the various local flavors and identities in which he dabbles. Now, despite this coming from a dictionary of political thought, you can probably tell here that we actually have some evaluative language from Scruton. In a sense, if you're familiar with Roger Scruton and his politics, you might not be so surprised to find that evaluative language in there. But certainly this idea of the parasite, that certainly seems to be a kind of value judgment being made about the cosmopolitan, and also this idea of dabbling in local flavors and identities. So there's a kind of negative quality or critical quality to this definition. It's certainly not a neutral definition. Certainly some value judgments sliding in there. So I personally have a bit of a problem with Scruton's definition there. I don't really feel that I'm not really sure why he felt the need to bring those value judgments in. And so against that definition, I want to put up this quotation from Jeremy Waldron, who in his article, What is Cosmopolitan?, points out that the idea of a pure culture, which Scruton's definition seems to suggest is possible, the idea of a pure culture, uncontaminated in its singularity, is an anomaly. For human cultures, it's the rule, not the exception, that ideas and ways of doing things are propagated and transmitted, noticed and adapted. No doubt from a purist's point of view, they are violated and distorted in the process, but my point is that there is nothing normative about the purist's point of view. So that definition then that Scruton provides, with its rather negative value judgments there, seems to suggest that there is some kind of pure culture, and this idea that if you have any interest at all in other cultures, that you are dabbling or being parasitical upon those cultures. So against Scruton's idea of the parasite then, Waldron suggests the cosmopolitan as one who wishes to share experiences with others. And he includes in his article this Latin quotation from Terence, which translates, sorry, this is M.I.A. Translating from Terence, I am human, nothing human is alien to me. So the idea that just through the community of humanity, if you like, there is this sense in which, although we encounter strangeness and the unfamiliar, we also have that kind of common bond as well, which is the common bond of humanity. Cosmopolitanism, M.I.A. suggests, starts with what is human in humanity. And it also relies, we might say, on imaginary connections to each other, but also to each other's cultural objects, beliefs, and creations as well. Connection, therefore, comes not through identity, but despite difference. And we can respond to art that is not ours, M.I.A. says. Indeed, we can fully respond to our art only if we move beyond thinking of it as ours and start to respond to it as art. Now you might notice in here what he seems to be suggesting is a kind of argument against the critique of appropriation. Often we talk about people who have cosmopolitan tastes, for example, in art, as Scruton would say, dabbling in other cultures and being parasitical upon them. And that connects, although Scruton's coming from a very kind of right-wing position, it also connects to a left-wing critique of cultural appropriation as well. And what M.I.A. is trying to do here, I think, is to try and navigate a way between these sort of rather conservative values on the one hand and these kind of more supposedly progressive critiques of cultural appropriation on the other, by suggesting that actually in looking for what connects us as humans, we need to actually stop thinking about what is ours and this idea of kind of cultural ownership, and actually think about how we can communicate with each other through processes such as art. Now that might connect also if you want to think back to Moti Regev's work that we were looking at a couple of weeks ago when we studied global rock cultures. We looked at Regev's book Pop Rock Music at that time. And Regev also uses this idea of cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitanization in relation to the arts, or what he calls aesthetic cosmopolitanization. And he refers to this as an ongoing formation in late modernity of world culture as one complexly interconnected entity in which social groupings of all types around the globe growingly share wide common grounds in their aesthetic perceptions, expressive forms, and cultural practices. Aesthetic cosmopolitanism refers to the already existing singular world culture, the state of affairs reached following the above. So Regev also is trying to steer a path here through this rather conservative idea of, national identities and traditions and unchanging stabilities to national cultures, which a philosopher like Scruton would often lean towards, and the kind of more progressive, left-wing critical position of cultural appropriation, the idea that one is taking from other cultures. Regev is suggesting, a little bit like M.I.A., that actually we're already connected, and in the world that we live in this highly globalized world, to actually carve off things in terms of regional ownership or national ownership or cultural ownership is actually to ignore the interconnectedness that we already have. Now, in thinking about aesthetic cosmopolitanism and Regev's ideas, and in thinking about global pop music in the 21st century, I want to think of how many of the musical examples that we've already studied, particularly in the global rock cultures and global hip-hop and DJ cultures lectures, are examples of this aesthetic cosmopolitanism. But for this week, I also want to draw your attention to a couple of particular musical case studies, one of them being M.I.A. and the other being Manu CHao. And I've already asked you to look at some videos, so hopefully you're familiar with their music. You will also find some of their music on this week's Spotify channel as well, and I'd encourage you to explore these really interesting artists and their work more widely as well. So Manu CHao is a French artist of Spanish descent who sings in a wide variety of languages, most commonly French, Spanish and English, but he's also sung in Italian, Arabic, Catalan, Galician, Portuguese, Greek as well. And this is very much part of his music, part of his the way that he thinks about music as a kind of global communication or a cosmopolitan communication. And what he calls, using a Spanish term, música mestiza, a sort of mixed or mestizo musical, hybrid musical culture. So that comes through in terms of the musical styles. He draws on reggae, he draws on rock music, he draws on some folk music elements, he draws on some Latin music elements as well. And it certainly comes through in terms of the themes that he sings about and the languages in which he sings them. So there's a couple of tracks on the Spotify playlist which you can listen to, and also the video of the song Clandestino, which I've asked you to have a look at. And that's a really interesting book, that's a really interesting album, Clandestino, and there's also been an interesting book written about it. And the writer of that book has written an article in The Guardian about the making of that album, which you can access by clicking on the link on this slide. Manu CHAO's musical partner, Renaud Letang, describes the making of that album as giving birth to a UFO, this idea that between them they had created this strange, new, unidentified musical hybrid that hadn't really been experienced before. I think when we listen to Manu CHAO now, bear in mind this is an album that came out in the late 1990s, I think when we listen to Manu CHAO now, we might not find that music quite so unusual as people did 20 years ago. And I think that's partly because of the way that pop music culture has gone. I mean, we're very used to hearing music, for example, in Spanish these days, partly through the growth of genres like reggaeton and just a growing kind of influence, really, of Latina artists in pop culture. Just last week, for example, J Balvin's new album came out, Colores, which you may have listened to. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to do so, which gives us a really interesting idea of where the state of global pop is at the moment, in as much as J Balvin we don't necessarily think of as a global pop artist, but just a pop artist. So that idea of the global that we've been exploring through the course of this module, to a certain extent, is just the world of pop music now. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about it in terms of its global context, and that's what I've been trying to get you to do during this module. When we listen to an artist like Manu CHAO now, it strikes me that he was really, quite ahead of his time in kind of predicting the sort of polyglot, mestiza musical culture that would come to the fore increasingly in popular music. So I think we should listen to Manu CHAO then as very much someone who sort of anticipated a kind of more global mixed culture. And I guess this is the point, really, often when we talk about cosmopolitanism, and certainly when we talk about utopia, which is the other theme I want you to think about this week. We're often thinking about a society to come, a society that we may not have yet achieved, a union that we may not have yet achieved, but something that we can imagine, a way of getting on with people that we can imagine and that we can think is not too far away. And music is one of the great ways, really, that we are able to think about that and to imagine that possibility. And musical mixing and musical hybridity has always allowed us to follow, to imagine the routes that humanity might take. And so when you listen to Manu CHAO, I want you to listen to a musician who seemed to be trying to get those messages across to us 20 years ago. M.I.A. I think we can listen to similarly in terms of roots and roots. Both ways we've looked at that word on this module. M.I.A. is a British artist, but of Sri Lankan descent, and often in her career she has made reference to her Sri Lankan culture and the background of her family, both in terms of the politics of Sri Lanka, which her father was very involved with, and also the sense of moving between cultures, of moving between her existence in Britain and her existence in Sri Lanka as well. And as her musical career has developed, she has sampled a wide range of global musical idioms, much like Manu CHao, and hybrid forms as well. So again, on the playlist, on the Spotify playlist for this week, there are a number of songs of hers. There's the song Freedom, which is from an album from a few years ago, featuring Zayn, that is Zayn Malik of One Direction, and that gives a pretty good sense, I think, of the M.I.A. sound. There's the Sound of Kuduro, which I've also provided as a video, and this is a song on which she appears as a guest artist with that Portuguese group Baraka Som Sistema, also collaborating with Angolan Kuduro musicians. I've included on the Spotify playlist her track Mango Pickle Down River, which is actually a barely cover version, because it's so similar to the original, of a track by Australian Aboriginal children's rap collective called Wilcannia Mob. And it's just a classic example, I think, of the way in which M.I.A. picks up on cultural forms from different parts of the world that other people may not be so familiar with, and then introduces them as a kind of curator to new audiences. And then there's that track Jimmy as well, which is her sort of version or sampling of the Bollywood song from the 1982 film Disco Dancer. This is Janyna Brown, whose article, Buzz and Rumble, Global Pop Music and Utopian Impulse, I'm asking you to read as this week's set reading. And one of the artists that Janyna Brown writes about is M.I.A. And writing about M.I.A.'s album Kala, Brown writes, "It signals not just the one-way movement of refugees, asylum seekers and economic migrants from Africa and Asia to Europe, but also the cross-migratory relationships created between displaced Africans and Asians as a result of globalizing capital and global wars. The movement is not just Bush to block, it's about the porousness between underdeveloped and overdeveloped worlds, the presence and effects of modern technologies in the global south. This seems to me the direction that global popular music can take us. In this world, Sri Lanka and the Congo are neighboring states. Post-millennial global pop music is produced out of a world now linked in complex webworks. Satellites, cell phones, and other communication electronics reach into previously isolated sites." So I think there's a few things to pick up there. One is something that we've already picked up previously on this module, which is this interconnected network, much of it online, that connects global popular musics around the world. So when we were looking at World Music 2.0 and the Seismographic Sounds project, that's a very clear example of the webworks and satellites and cell phone communication electronics connecting previously isolated sites. It also connects with Chase Clayton's writing in his book Uproot as well, where he also talks a lot about these networks. There's also that aspect of the movement of people, the asylum seekers, refugees, economic migrants, and the movement of people, and how that's always connected to the movement of music as well. And the connection, between that and what Brown calls here globalizing capital. So it's really important, and I think she sets this up very well in the introduction to her article. It's really important that when she talks about utopia in this article, she is very, very aware that she is talking about a world that contains many dystopias, many war zones, many places of, economic collapse and disaster and bad politics and suffering. So she opens the article actually with a recognition of all these dystopian sites that there are around the world. But she still wants to reclaim this idea of utopia as an idea of a world to come, of a possibility. And she looks to some musical examples as ways of illustrating the possibilities. And one of the examples she looks at is M.I.A. Another example she looks at is the group Konono Number One and the record label Crammed Discs, which I've referred to previously on the module when we were talking about international music. And she looks at how this Congolese music that's been released by the Belgian label Crammed Discs could offer another way of thinking about how out of dystopian sites we get the possibility of utopian connections as well. And that's why she's saying here in this quotation that Sri Lanka and Congo are neighbouring states, because as well as being her chosen musical examples, they're also worlds which are connected through similar experiences and through the intercommunication are available on the web as well. Now, I've dwelt here on the two main musical examples I wanted you to think about during the lecture, which were Manu CHao and M.I.A. But you'll notice on the Blackboard site, particularly if you go and look at the additional resources for this week, that I've also put up a whole load of Korean videos as well. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is because I think K-pop, and we've discussed this before, particularly in the seminar a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about global rock and pop cultures. K-pop, I think, is a great example of a 21st century global pop music that is both kind of nationally and regionally identifiable, but has also had this really interesting global boom in recent years, to the point where there are there are K-pop fans all around the world. There is an increasing knowledge about K-culture, Korean culture, that's come about purely because of people have got so interested in K-pop. So people hear the music, they get interested in the music, then they want to find out about the artists, they want to find out about the choreography, they want to find out about the fan culture, they want to find out about Korean food, they want to find out about fashion, Korean fashion, and all kinds of other things as well, Korean film. And there's been a huge increase in people wanting to travel to Seoul. So, but for example, when I was in Seoul twice a couple of years ago for music conferences, and a lot of the people I met there who were staying in the same accommodation that I was in had traveled to Seoul purely in order to go and follow up on connections that had come about through K-pop. So they were looking for particular sites, cafes owned by K-pop artists, sites of videos. So there's lots of famous, cityscapes in Seoul and other parts of Korea that have been used in videos. So there's this whole fascination with the culture that's come about through K-pop. Psy, of course, back in 2012, was at that time, really not essentially a K-pop artist, but he's been lumped in with K-pop because he provided an example of how something that seemed to be so local and so regionally specific, his track Gangnam Style, could be translated and represented elsewhere. Even while people found it a bit weird and a bit strange, it could travel virally and become this massive thing. So becoming at the time the most watched YouTube video ever, and with people performing the Gangnam Style dance all around the world. So although maybe not a classic K-pop artist in the sense of the idol groups like FX or Wonder Girls or these kind of artists, Psy is still a very interesting moment in 21st century musical culture, and a point at which we might detect a kind of shift in terms of where we start to think of the centres and the peripheries and the margins of global music culture being. At the same time, I've been talking about cosmopolitanism in this lecture, and I do wonder to what extent K-pop could be thought of as a cosmopolitan music. There seems to be a very strong sense of a kind of monoculture in Korea, so that even as musically it takes on all these different styles and languages and iconographies from around the world, it has a rather kind of homogeneous image as well. And that's an interesting tension, which I think is potentially worth exploring further. So going back to Janyna Brown then, and this idea of utopia, and I'd like you to explore this further as you read her article. Brown writes that what she's looking for is a way to think about music from disparate sites, not delimited by nation-state boundaries, and the possibilities for translocal formations of social connectivity. And she also writes, we must make a distinction between a utopia of personal gratification and that which is glimpsed, felt, or created collectively within the material relations of its creation. And in that second quotation, what she's really trying to get at is, I think, connected to what I was earlier talking about as the distinction between being a tourist in the world, having the privilege to travel around the world and indulge your cosmopolitan tastes, and this idea of being a kind of a vagabond or being someone who is forced to travel for different reasons. So she wants to remind us that her discussion is a discussion that relates to this very real material world, but that if we think of utopia not as just something that is there for us, as a personal ambition, if you like, or a way of living out a personal privilege, but as a way of thinking collectively, that's what she's trying to argue for. And she suggests that music does allow us to glimpse that possibility. So I'm going to wrap up now. In thinking about this week's work, obviously there's this lecture, there's the reading that I'm asking you to do, which is Janyna Brown's article about utopian impulse in global pop music. There's a Spotify playlist, as normal, which I'd like you to listen to. There is the videos that I've provided. If you look in the additional resources as well, there are a whole load of videos there. I've put a load of, as I say, a lot of K-pop particularly, because I think it's an interesting case study of how we think of global pop music in the 21st century. And I'd also like you to think about the recent sessions we've done on global rock, hip-hop, DJ cultures. Think about how, all of that connects to Moti Regev's idea of aesthetic cosmopolitanism, the idea of international artistic communities, international genres. Do you remember we were talking in the seminar the other week about expressive isomorphism and how you've got these genres that crop up all around the world. Common ways of making and listening to music as well. Okay. I'd like you to think about how cosmopolitanism and utopia get connected to critiques of cultural appropriation, but also how those arguments are counter-critiqued as well. And I think if you're not really sure what I mean by that, have a read of Janyna Brown's article, and hopefully you'll get a sense of what the twists and turns of this argument, and that's something we can pick up in further discussion. Okay, that's it. That wraps up the content part of the module. That's the 9th and the final lecture. We obviously can continue discussing ideas around the module as a whole and around your assessment as well as we go forward in this uncertain time. Thanks a lot.